Welcome to On Garden Cultures. A special warm welcome to today's speakers, Suresh Jayaram and Amita Baviskar. It's our honor and privilege to have you both here today. For those of you who have just joined us, this program is a part of an exhibition called Phytopia of Science Gallery Bengaluru. We are a part of an international network of university-linked galleries, and in Bangalore, we have been established with the founding support of the government of Karnataka. We have Indian Institute of Science, National Center for Biological Sciences, and Shrishti as our academic partners. This particular program has been organized in collaboration with the Bangalore International Center. I'd like to take a moment to request you to please complete the feedback form after you've been through the experience this evening. And most critically, please post your questions in the Q&A box provided. I'm delighted to introduce the sociologist Amita Baviskar to you all. Dr. Amita Baviskar is currently a professor of sociology at the Institute of Economic Growth, Delhi. She has explored the politics of environment, development, and popular resistance in both urban and rural spaces for over 2 decades now. For her contributions to sociology, Dr. Baviskar received the 2004 M.N. Srinivas Memorial Prize and the 2010 Infosys Prize for Social Sciences, amongst many other accolades. I'm equally excited to introduce Suresh Jayaram, who will be joining us in a moment. But today's discussion is going to be about garden cultures. Parks in urban spaces like Lal Bagh in Bengaluru and Lodhi Gardens in Delhi offer a refuge from the stress and the sensory assault of city life. However, each urban park also tells a story about the empire and the nation, about movement and migration, and about changing cultural styles. Our speakers today have researched and written about the history and labor that went behind the creation of these urban parks. Amita, if you could begin by telling our audience about the history and social meanings of gardens in a city like Delhi.
Thanks, Gayatri. And thank you, Phytopia, for inviting me. I should also say, by the way, that besides being at the Institute of Economic Growth, I am also at Ashoka University, where I teach environmental studies and sociology, anthropology. Those of us who garden, and even those like me who grow things only on a small balcony, we have a number of reasons for why we plant what we do. We grow green things because they refresh our eyes. We plant flowers because they brighten our day. We grow particular plants for puja, to offer flowers to gods. We grow things to cook with, and we grow things which have medicinal properties. So sometimes we grow things which are robust and dependable, sometimes unusual and exotic, and sometimes sentimental things, the scent of something that takes us back to our childhood, or perhaps something that our parents planted. So all gardens tell stories about who we are, about our personal tastes, and about our personal histories. And it's not just private gardens, even grand public parks tell stories about empire and about nation, about power and spectacle, and surprisingly, about nostalgia and being homesick. They tell us about clashing ideas of beauty, and if we pay attention, they also reveal a backstage world where the work of making gardens takes place. So I'm going to meander through the gardens of Delhi, but focus first on a rather special one, and that's the Mughal garden on the Rashtrapati Bhavan estate. About 6 years ago, I was asked to edit a book on this subject, and I worked with the team, biologist Ghazala Shahabuddin, naturalist Pradeep Krishan, and photographer Narendra Bisht. And we were expected to produce a sort of lavish coffee table style book, but I thought we could do much more. And I thought this was a chance to look critically and carefully at the cultural politics of cultivated landscapes, to look at the first garden of the Republic. That's what we called our book, and learn something about gardening as it has changed over the years in all of India. I'm going to show you some slides now. It doesn't get much grander than this. This is the forecourt of the Rashtrapati Bhavan. And what you're looking at is a vista from the Rashtrapati Bhavan down to India Gate. And this is, of course, this was meant to be a statement about British power, about the empire on which the sun never sets. And the Viceroy's palace, as it was then assumed to be, or government house, had this majestic iconography to impress upon natives the idea that the British were here to stay in this new capital city of New Delhi. And the man who was chosen to design the city was Edwin Lutyens. And not only did he design all of Delhi, but he also surveyed the city and decided on Raisina Hill as the epicenter of this imperial capital. Raisina Hill, where the Viceroy's house would be situated, overlooking from a grand height the old city of Shahjahanabad. Now, in order to build here, first they raised the height of Raisina Hill by about 20 feet, blasting hard rock to flatten it. Water was piped uphill all the way from the Yamuna. And this was a 330-acre estate. The house itself had a footprint of 5 acres, and the pleasure gardens, 15 acres with fountains. All in all, in a country where most people labored on the proverbial do bhiga zameen to make, in order to make a living. The sheer scale of the estate and its pleasure gardens was a form of conspicuous consumption. And what it proclaimed was the preeminence of the British Raj over India. And here in what you see is Edwin Lutyens, the man in the dark suit with the pipe. In the middle is Musto. And William Musto was a Mali who was brought in from England. First, he worked in Lahore at the government nursery there. And later, he was brought into Delhi to plant all the avenue trees of Delhi and then also to plant up the president's estate. Lutyens was a working class man. He grew up as a gardener, as was his father, on a stately estate in England. He was then recruited to work at Kew Gardens, and that's how he made his way then to India. And Lutyens, it said, had breakfast with Musto every morning when he was in Delhi, and they decided what they would plant in Delhi. The story of the avenue trees of Delhi has already been told very well by Pradeep Krishan. So I'm going to focus only on the president's estate, where trees were planted over a 10-year period, 1919 to 1929. After most of Delhi had been planted up, and Musto decided what would be grown in the garden that Lutyens had created. Now, I want you to look at this picture and see that all the little dots that you have there are actually tiny saplings. And these were what later grew into these majestic trees. And it takes a certain amount of cultural confidence, no matter how illusory it was, to plant trees in the hope that they will grow to such magnificent shape and size. And the British had that cultural confidence. I don't think we have that anymore with our demand for fast growing trees. Our horizons have shrunk. But anyway, that's a point I'll come to again later. And I will just go on to point out what these gardens and trees were meant to achieve by way of effect. The present estate was modeled on the conventional British idea of an aristocratic home, where what you had was were formal gardens with flower beds, a rolling park of green lawn, and in the distance, woods. And that is, in fact, what you get in the case of the Rashtrapati Bhavan as well. Here are the formal gardens called the Mughal gardens for reasons I'll explain in a minute. Um, and the scale of the gardens, not just the size, but the staff needed to take care of them was huge. You had 418 people just as gardeners, 50 men to scare away birds, 20 people just to make flower arrangements. So this was living on a really grand scale. Well, it took 17 years to build New Delhi, and 16 more years passed, and then the British had to leave. So all that cultural confidence came to nothing, and we had our independent Indian government. You see here Rajaji and Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Governor General and the first Prime Minister, with Edwina Mountbatten, the wife of the outgoing Viceroy. The British left, but their gardens remained. And I now want to just take a closer look at what these gardens are and what they represent. So what these Mughal gardens bring together are actually two very different horticultural traditions. It was at the urging of a woman who wrote about the Mughal gardens in India, Constance Villiers Stuart, who then persuaded Lady Hardinge that Lutyens adopted the formal layout of what is called the Char Bagh, the enclosed garden, bisected by water channels, planted up with fruit trees like the pomegranates that you see in this picture. And this was a Persian ideal, best suited in an arid land where an enclosed garden was a space where you could create a kind of microclimate which would be cool and pleasant in the heat. And this Persian ideal was brought to India by Babur. And here you see an illustration from the Baburnama, his journal. And Babur hated the dusty, hot plains of North India. And he was homesick for his highland place of origin, its rushing streams, and its pomegranate and apricot and peach trees. And so wherever Babur went, and subsequently his other descendants like Humayun and Shah Jahan and Jahangir, they built these char bags, creating some of the most glorious pieces of some more glorious gardens that still exist in Srinagar, in Delhi, in Agra, and elsewhere. And if this was one nostalgic stream of gardening, the other one was, in fact, the English country garden. You have to think of all these English men and women, but mainly women, mainly the Mem Sahibs, stuck there in this hot, dusty plain, longing for the cool green England that they had left behind, with their gardens of roses and pansies and hollyhocks. And so in order to bring that little sense of home with them, they would end up carefully cultivating these symbols of home in the short winter months in India. They would order in seeds and they would set their malis to work. And there's a slight irony here, because what they thought of as these quintessential English flowers, they're pretty little pansies, some of the roses, the daisies, dahlias. Most of these plants were actually not English at all. They had come from Central America, from South Africa, from India, from China, and it was basically a circulation of species that the empire had made possible that was now being prized and valued as the English garden. And in this mix of sentiment and status, perhaps the most distinctive English element, which we still continue to treasure, is the lawn, because the lawn was something that showed that you had not only land, but you would command the labor that would do the watering and the weeding and the mowing, all the incessant work that went into maintaining a green lawn in a hot and dry climate. And the lawn was a proclamation of English status. It was about race and class. And it was also a place of socializing, of tea parties and garden receptions. And we continue with maintaining our lawns in this rather ecologically expensive way, even though we have moved now to more democratic times. And most gardens now, like the Rashtrapati Bhavan one that you see here, not only has people admiring the flowers, but more important, recording themselves in the middle of the flowers in the form of taking selfies. Let me now quickly move backstage to the work of gardening. This is something that we don't really talk about, even though it's absolutely essential to the gardens that we enjoy. And I think it's important to note the kinds of changes that have taken place in gardening over the years, because they have a direct effect on what we grow and how we grow it. In the Rashtrapati Bhavan gardens, for instance, most of the people who worked there were hereditary employees. You employed the father, the son would join. There were people from particular castes, like the Saini market gardeners of Rajasthan. And these were people who passed on the knowledge of gardening, what was in their hands, in their muscle memory, in their eyes, in their heads, from one generation to another through apprenticeship. You learned on the job. And this is how people manage to deal with all the very specific elements of that any garden has. The play of light and shade, of water and season, the pests that come along, how things change now because of climate change or because of air pollution, when you have smog hanging in Delhi over several months. All of these things change what gardeners must do, and their skills must keep up with what is going on. However, what we find in the case of most government parks which employ gardeners is that, as is happening in the rest of government too, a lot of the lower level jobs, and of course, gardening jobs are always regarded as unskilled jobs, are being outsourced. So you no longer have a tradition of people who are permanently employed, who are learning from each other and passing on their skills to others. Now you have a rotating workforce where people come in, work for a month on minimum wages, they get chucked out, and they're good for nothing except the heavy lifting and maybe watering plants. So if we want gardening to continue as something which is a skillful job, we have to think about how gardeners learn from each other. There are very few formal courses that teach you what gardening is all about, because like any vocation, it's something that requires constant practice, constant meditation about what you're doing. You get better by learning on the job, and the conditions for that kind of learning, of practicing a vocation, don't really exist anymore. And therefore, what we have is that the older Malis who used to know things like how to make bonsai or for how to craft roses, no longer, they've retired, and there's nobody to take over their jobs. And what we have instead is a change in the species. So the Rashtrapati Bhavan, where Musto had planted 350 varieties of roses, now has perhaps about 20 or 30. But what they have been replaced with are tulips. And the reason why tulips are preferred over roses is that you can buy tulip bulbs from the floral industrial complex of the Netherlands. And these are bulbs that are genetically engineered to plant by a certain date. So 26th January, when the president has his reception on the Rashtrapati Bhavan lawns, you know that these bulbs are going to flower on time and make this grand spectacle for people to see. So the roses of Zakir Hussein's time, of K.R. Narayanan's time, are now rapidly being replaced by tulips. I see I have about 3 minutes left, so I'm going to quickly run along and talk about the ways in which we need to think not only about the Rashtrapati Bhavan garden with all its particularities, but also it has some general lessons for what we think about gardens today, and focus on what are threats to our public parks more generally. There's usually a very strong correlation between where parks are, between the center of the city. This is Lodhi Gardens in Delhi. You find a density of beautiful trees and green spaces. And as you go along to the working class areas, the bastis, the poorer neighborhoods, there are far fewer green areas that people can use and enjoy. And even in the center of the city now, low-rise neighborhoods with their old trees are rapidly being replaced by high rises as these neighborhoods get denser and denser. So we don't really have a good policy of thinking about trees as part of our urban ecological heritage, planning in ways that we can protect what we have, instead of thinking that, well, we can chop them down and replace them with some fast growing trees and we have, a green landscape. The places which are green still in the city sometimes, and by green, I mean areas of wilderness, are usually derelict edges, lake shores, floodplains, in Delhi, the ridge forest. And these are wilderness areas that have usually supported a wide range of people. Women collecting firewood for fuel, these could be migrant laborers, or boys out to play a game of cricket in the only open space they have around their basti. These open areas are also ecologically important as refugia for wildlife, but many of them now have been cleared up, turned into ornamental gardens with lawns planted up, and there is usually a, a general decline both in their ecological value and in what they offer to poorer citizens and to children. Um, there is also, I think, a problem of municipal monotony, that what we plant in our gardens, because it's meant to be low maintenance and quick growing, is generally really boring. We plant just a few trees, a few shrubs, and for the ones for Delhi, I can list on one hand practically. We go on as if we had no imagination, as if we had, no larger treasure of trees and plants to choose from. There are also fashions in gardening. And when I think, for instance, of hedges, I look at my own Institute of Economic Growth. All that the Malis want to plant now as a hedge is Ficus benjamina. It's evergreen, it's easy to prune, and you can leave it alone. And as long as you keep giving it enough water, it does fine. And I think back to my childhood, and I think of all the hedges we used to have. We used to have mehendi and dodonia and pulai and muraya and a whole lot more. And now these are completely gone to be replaced by just one species. Well, for that matter, actually, hedges have also disappeared because what we now have are tall walls topped with broken glass and barbed razor wire fences. Finally, I want to talk about the fact that even though things look rather grim and depressing for many of our public parks, there are always surprises. And I don't think when our park designers went to work, they expected that these green areas would be taken over by courting couples, by people who are seeking privacy in, rather oddly, paradoxically, a public park. And the the intent behind a number of parks, be it Frederick Law Olmsted's design of Central Park, or be it Company Bagh in Lahore, as the historian Will Glover reminds us. The idea was that that these are meant for the natives to learn how to behave properly in public. They shouldn't be drunk and disorderly. They shouldn't spit and throw litter about. But instead, what we see is a whole array of users going for brisk morning walks, hiding behind a bush in order to steal a kiss, children running around, ladies sitting together and having a prayer meeting, a pratna, a satsang, a kirtan. There are all sorts of things that go on in our public parks, and we have to have a more public conversation about how to reconcile the ecological values of our parks with the public purposes for which they are intended. I'll stop there, and I'm sorry for going on a little longer than I should have.
Thank you so much, Amita, for that fascinating presentation and for also bringing terms like the floral industrial complex into our vocabulary. I would now like to invite our next speaker, Suresh Jayaram, to speak about his work. He's an artist, art historian, and curator from Bangalore. He's the founder and director of the visual art collective One Shanti Road, which is an international artist residency and an alternative art space in Bangalore. His keen interest in environmental and urban development issues influence his work, and he taught art history at the Karnataka Chitrakala Parishad, the College of Fine Arts in Bangalore, and later went on to become the Dean of the Chitrakala Parishad from 2005 to 2007. Before I pass on the mic to Suresh, I would like to remind our audience that please post your questions in the Q&A box provided, because we will have a Q&A session after Suresh is done with his presentation. Over to you, Suresh.
Thank you, Gayatri. And it was very nice to hear you, Amita. It was really amazing to see the context of the gardens in Delhi. And now we're going to come into the Deccan Plateau. That's where Bangalore is situated. And going back to the history and a bit of nostalgia about the city and how it is being made. I will ask Gayatri to help me with the putting on the PowerPoint. Yeah. Thank you. Something about my own background. I've been blessed to live between the two important gardens of Bangalore. One is Lal Bagh and Government Park. So the location seems to be very apt for me to think about gardens and work about these particular gardens. Always lived in homes which had gardens, and the whole family has a connection with the gardens of Bangalore. My grandparents were farmers and also had small orchards in the central part of the city. And the most important thing I heard as a child was that my grandmother told me that they grew apples. So this was so fairy tale like, and really tickled my imagination. And this is what led me to look into the gardens and also research a lot about the different kinds of plants and trees that have become part of the Bangalore landscape. Something which I want to also acknowledge and state that was my previous project, which is about Gustav Hermann Krumbigel, which was done about 10 years ago. Raghu Tenkalaya, a friend and also who's part of BIC now, was part of the team that investigated and researched about this project, about the German horticulturists who made the cereal blossoming possible in the city of Bangalore. And before that, we'd like to go back to a few slides that would talk about the history of the city and the landscape. I will go to the first slide. Here is a slide, which is of a cypress garden, and it is a landscape of Coolbrook, and it was made in 1793. So this idea of the landscape painting or a viewpoint also became a significant part. The same work is also part of the larger landscape of the city of Bangalore. Because the mantap which you see on top of the rock is a vantage point where we could see the whole of the city of Bangalore. It also becomes important later on because it's called the Tower of Kempegowda. It's interesting to look at the cypress garden, and also this particular map kind of locates the garden within the larger context of the city of Bangalore. So here you have the Kote, which is the fort, and the Pete, the area, the commercial area which is attributed to Kempegowda, and the streets that are laid out and the business districts of the city that are laid out. And you also see the fort, which is very dominant, the oval shaped fort, where the administrative spaces were made. And the Lal Bagh garden was to the east of this particular fort. So it was slightly outside the main area of the city. So the important coordinates here would be the Kote, which is the fort, the Pete, which is the business district, and the Tota. The Tota is a garden in Kannada. So the Kote, Pete, and Tota becomes three important tangents for making of the city during Kempegowda's time. Next slide. Here is a new map of the city of Lal Bagh, which clearly gives you an idea how Lal Bagh is laid out. So the layout is very, very specific. We have a central axis, which moves from east to west. And later on, I'll try and show you what was the main kind of architectural edifice that dominates Lal Bagh, which is the glass house. But also we see that the long history of Lal Bagh is from the Kempegowda's time, in where this mantap becomes a very important insignia for the corporation of the city, the BBMP of the city. Next slide. Here on this ancient rock, we have the mantap early in the morning, and we also see that this mantap is also part of many the larger landscape of Bangalore. So we have 4 mantaps in 4 cardinal directions. People also say that there were other mantaps which kind of looked over. These mantaps basically are kind of watchtowers that had watchmen or people who looked out for any attacks that were coming from outside the city. So they were very strategically located at the highest points of the city. Now it has become a tourist attraction and also a very important insignia of the city. Next. Here is Kempe Gowda, the iconic founder of the city. And with him, we see the inauguration of the modern idea of making of Bangalore. And also he's very significantly made visible in different parts of Bangalore. So many Kempe Gowda statues, but this is the first Kempe Gowda statue which was in front of the city corporation. And incidentally, if you look closely at Kempe Gowda, you'll see him wearing a Mysore turban, but his costume or dress is very North Indian. So he wears a sherwani and a pajama, and also footwear that is like the Rajasthani footwear. So it's interesting way the sculptor has kind of sculpted Kempe Gowda in his own imagination. Next slide, yeah. 2 important people who were responsible for making of Lal Bagh. One is Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan were responsible for laying out char baghs, again connection with Delhi, the Mughals, etc. So I believe there was a char bagh closer to Bangalore of a Mughal general who ruled in parts of this area in the Deccan. So Hyder Ali wanted to have a char bagh, and the first instance of a char bagh was envisioned in Lal Bagh. There are a lot of stories about how the char baghs were not inside the boundary of the present Lal Bagh, but at the same time, the Lal Bagh extended outside. So there is a wall that is around Lal Bagh, and there's also a lot of kind of nurseries around this area. So according to researchers and according to people, they believe that there were many char baghs or gardens around Lal Bagh, and one of them was a char bagh which was inspired by the Mughal gardens. So both these kings brought in a lot of exotic plant species from different parts of India, including Multan and Persia and Mauritius, etc. There was a lot of botanical diplomacy that emerged during this particular period, making this kind of plant migration possible at that particular time and context. Next, please. This is the iconic glass house, which is in the heart of Lal Bagh, and it is very significantly located in the axis of Lal Bagh. So when Lal Bagh was built, it was a question of how the British could emphasize its power on the sultans who they defeated in 1799. So Lal Bagh has this very dominant architecture, incidentally inspired by the Crystal Palace of London. And it was kind of commissioned by John Cameron, one of the few trained horticulturists who came and worked in Lal Bagh. And this forms the main axis, and most of the flower shows, which used to happen around a particular bandstand, which you'll see later, were moved into the larger glass house. Interesting idea of when the glass house is not used as a kind of an arboreum. We see that it is like an empty shell where you see the tropical greenery outside um, the glass house, and you see the glass house literally empty, as you see in this slide today. So when the flower shows happen, it's very joyous, and it's an occasion where everybody comes. And like in Delhi, flowers are made to bloom according to seasons during January 26th of the Republic Day and August 15th. So flowers are plants are manipulated in a very nationalistic spirit. So bulbs are made to bloom at that particular time. Roses are grafted to blossom at a specific occasion. So the best garden and the best flowers and the best nurseries compete with each other. So the flower shows were initially kind of proposed by the Mysore Horticultural Society, which was a kind of a body that encouraged gardening a lot. It also trained a lot of youngsters in the art of gardening, grafting, and it also got in a lots of different kinds of seeds and plants, and encouraged people to grow exotic plants and especially English vegetables, which I'll come to later. Next slide. Here is another landscape. And if you look at this landscape, you cannot imagine that this was a landscape of Bangalore, because you see it very barren, and all the greenery that you see today in Bangalore is thanks to the long period of plant migration that has happened from the British times. When the British took over Lal Bagh, the East India Company was very conscious to create an economic botany forum. And in this process, they were trying to look at how they could look at economic botany as an important exercise in harnessing a lot of plant wealth, which was part of the Mysore kingdom at that particular context. Next slide. So this particular landscape was also called naked country because of the barren land, because of the rocky terrain, and because of a very sparse kind of landscape. Here you will see the bandstand, which is a very important place in Lal Bagh. The English band used to play here, and the first flower shows happened around the bandstand. And from what we see from the archive, we see that the bandstand is a very, very important location. It just comes after the fountain that is in front of the glass house, and the bandstand becomes a kind of a center of Lal Bagh. And it kind of overpowers the Tipu's Char Bagh, which is supposed to be there. A new axis is created with this location of the glass house and the bandstand. Next slide. Also notice the Araucaria cookies, which are around the bandstand, and they also emphasize the power of the landscape and the way these trees are planted to emphasize a viewpoint, a kind of a Renaissance perspective to look at the landscape in a single point perspective from standing at the glass house and looking towards a topiary garden. Next slide. Here is an important seat again, I think made during the Krumbical time. It is called the Maharaja's seat. The last time I visited Lal Bagh, there was a sticker which says, "Don't sit here," because of the COVID situation. We still see this as a very important seat where instead of the Maharajas, we see the common people sitting, and it becomes a kind of a place where you get photographed and imagine you're the Maharaja. The next slide. Yes, Gayatri. Yeah. An equestrian statue which was moved from Mysore to Bangalore of Chamarajendra Wadiyar. It is in the center of the sculpture garden, which is circular in shape. It was designed and by Gustav Hermann Krumbiegel, and the most important trees, exotic trees from different parts of the world, from the Araucaria cookies to the gulmohars and to the royal palms, occupy the surrounding area of this enclosure. And this particular sculpture is significant and locates the Mysore Wadiyar in a very significant way. It also celebrates the Silver Jubilee era of the Mysore dynasty. Next slide. This is the fountain, and incidentally, you see the yellow tabubias from Argentina blooming. And this particular tree, which you see, is being planted by Pandit Nehru during his visit to Bangalore, and it is in full bloom. It also coincides with the other blossoms during spring or in Lal Bagh, and we are very grateful to to Krumbiegel, who kind of coined this idea of serial blossoming, where you have the jacarandas, the tabubias, the gulmohars, and the pride of different colored pride of India is blooming simultaneously. So in every season of Bangalore, you constantly see some flowers or some trees blooming, giving the idea of a perpetual spring in the erstwhile garden city. Next slide. But you also see that the fountain is again from Macfarlane Company from Glasgow. It has been imported like the glass house, and even the lampposts are kind of very exotic because they have an English aesthetic. It's wrought iron. Next slide. Here is the tabubias in full bloom, just to give you an idea how glorious they look, and they bloom extremely well in the climate of Bangalore. In Lal Bagh, you see a whole series of amazing botanical drawings, mostly done by native artists who were supervised by the British directors. I need to mention Cheluvaya Raju, a very important local artist who has created numerous botanical drawings which are preserved in the Lal Bagh archive. They form a set of almost 2,000 drawings and watercolors, and are extremely beautiful because they not only give the idea of the plants that were imported from different parts of the world, but also make you realize that these artists who were familiar in painting two-dimensional work are working with the new aesthetic that they have learned in the process of being trained and working with botanical specimens in front of them. Next. Another botanical drawing, and you could see the kind of detailing. Here you have this magnificent silk cotton tree, which is a kind of a highlight of Lal Bagh. It is very unusual because it is branched at a point where it is very stout, but at the same time it's got this girth which is fantastic. Some people say it is a hybrid, but at the same time we see most of these trees in Lal Bagh are much taller, but this has a larger girth, and it's believed to be about 150 years old, one of the oldest species in the Lal Bagh garden. Next slide. Here are some images of the tank. The Lal Bagh tank is very important because these tanks and keres or lakes, which we call, are part of the water bodies that dotted the city of Bangalore, and Bangalore relies on these water bodies and rainwater that is stored in these tanks and is used in the gardens. And the reflection which you see there are the palms that are reflected in this picture, and they also show you how there's a small bridge that connects the main area to the other side of Lal Bagh. Next one. Here is a new map which we tried to make, which kind of tells you the um, where we can see this greenery. Could also see the kind of axes that are drawn. We could see the kind of variations in the topography of Lal Bagh from the highest point of the rock to the level of where the topiary garden is in the west side of Lal Bagh. You also can see the lakes, and which is the major water body, and on the important axis of the glass house, the fountain, and the bandstand, and the other axis from south to north, which is the sculpture garden and the Chamarajendra statue, which I've already showed you. Next one. So a lot of water birds, a lot of aquatic plants, an amazing variety that is really staggering. Lal Bagh is known as one of the best gardens in Asia, and it is. We need to acknowledge the many directors from Cameroon, Krumbigal, Javaraya, and Marigauda. All of them have been Q trained and have contributed immensely to the horticultural wealth of this particular garden and the design of this garden, but also to the avenue tree planting that is visible in the streets of Bangalore even today. So Lal Bagh being so significant, not only historically but also in terms of its it being visited as a tourist attraction. It is quite an amazing place, and it always has something in bloom, surprises you every time you go there. And what is the most fascinating thing of the botanical garden was it also had a zoo and an aviary in the early part of the 19th century, but later on they were shifted to another place. But this was a very, very significant garden even today, and we see that it is the most visited place in Bangalore, and we see from joggers, walkers, lovers, everybody occupying this space. And this is one of the lungs other than Cubbon Park, which is closer to the cantonment area, which are places in the city that are constantly having to fight for attention, fight for protection, and also survive amidst the global climb of Bangalore city. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suresh. That was a fascinating presentation. I think for many of us who have lived in Bangalore or have visited the city, these sites are quite familiar, like the glass house and the bandstand. But it's quite fascinating to know the history of these spaces as well. So we have a couple of questions from the audience. Saraswati Ganapati wants to know, besides hedges, a common garden design seems to be to surround every tree or shrub with a neat circle of some small plants. Where does this come from?
Saraswati, I don't know, but it's worth investigating. It's a peculiar thing that, and not only do you have a neat circle of plants, you usually have bricks which are placed at an angle, and then they're usually painted white as well. That's also a very common garden feature of our gardens.
I think these hedges are there to define boundaries and also try to protect the trees when they are younger. But they become a prominent kind of a landscape element in the gardens today.
Right. So, Parishita Rajan wants to know what is the importance of native plants in public parks today, and what is the context behind how we can introduce them to public parks as well.
Suresh, do you want to go first?
There's always this tension about the native and the exotic. So in Bangalore, the most prominent flowering trees and plants have been from the outside world, and the native plants have their own position because some of them are very sacred, like the ficuses, especially the people and the banyan. And we also see that the tamarind or the mango and many other trees which are and the neem tree, which is extremely popular and visible in the landscape of the city. Amidst this, we also see the flowering trees, which are there for exotic reasons, and they have their own repercussions of becoming part of the larger landscape. And I think Delhi also has the same context, and Amita would tell us more about it.
Um, I think just to add to what Suresh said, we have not only native trees, but a lot of trees or plants which have naturalized. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that because, it's the nature of things to mix and naturalization happens all the time. I think there's a problem if a species becomes overwhelming and becomes invasive, in which case we need to be careful. But I think the principle to be followed all the time is that of maximizing biodiversity in a way that is ecologically suited to a particular climate, to a particular water and soil regime. So we've ignored a lot of our native plants, and we could, think about them and revalue them much more than we do now. But I don't think that should mean that we should, practice some form of indigenous fascism or something.
Right. So, Amita, Vineet Giri wants to know, did the English idea of gardens and green spaces influence the idea of nature and green cities as pursued by the bourgeois environmentalists in Delhi in late 1970s and 1980s? What has been the relationship of marginalized communities within the garden spaces in Delhi historically?
Wow, Vineet, that's a very large question, and I don't think at the time we have I can do justice to it. But I've written about it at greater length in my book, Uncivil City, Ecology, Equity, and the Commons in Delhi, which came out in January. So here I'll only say that I think uh, the elites in Delhi in the 1970s and 80s, people whom I call bourgeois environmentalists, their chief aim was to to live in an environment which was ordered, where there was a kind of spatial and social segregation that maintained a sense of comfort and ease for them. And in the quest of that particular order, we see that the wilder areas of Delhi, the ridge forests, the Yamuna floodplains, all of these have been manicured in a way by taking out the wild elements, by planting lawns, common plant species, and so on. And the sort of classic ways in which this kind of disciplining and even policing of the environment happens is that if you look at trees in a lot of public parks, you'll see that they have these white and red marks around their trunks. Now, why do trees need to have paint on them when they look fine as they are? But there's this kind of bureaucratic mind at work somewhere that this is our property, so we need to mark it and we need to enumerate it. Even in the pictures that Suresh showed of these rather graceful the fountain and the lampposts, they're ornate wrought iron, but they're painted in this completely tacky saffron white and green, which is supposed to be some sort of nationalist uh, way of celebrating the tricolor or something. you know we really need to think about what sensibility is at work here in how we deal with areas. To answer the final part of your question about working class people and their relationship with nature in the city, I'm afraid it's something which is unfortunately dwindling all the time. In the poorest bastis, I see people will have one or two, old tins or plastic buckets where they planted their one rose bush or one tulsi plant, or one agave shrub or something. That's unfortunately all that many of them have, because the commons that I refer to, the floodplains, the lake shores, the wilder areas, have either been encroached upon or they have been commodified and turned into elite spaces. So there is a constant battle that we have to fight in order to conserve what we have and to make sure that it stays accessible to everyone.
Right. Thank you so much. Suresh, Amita Balachandran wants to know the botanical gardens you showed us are beautiful. I wonder, is the Lal Bagh archive open to the public? Also, how much have the species of trees and plants altered and changed over the years?
The Lal Bagh archive is difficult to access, and it is you need permission. It is under lock and key most of the time. The building which the archive was in was in a library. These drawings which I showed you are extremely fragile. They are more than 100 years old, so you need special permission to look at it. So, trying to talk about the different kind of trees that are introduced to Lal Bagh or other areas is that Lal Bagh has a lot of nurseries around. So every time something gets fashionable in the garden scene, that you find these plants coming from the other nurseries into the nurseries in and around Lal Bagh. So it's also the fashion trends of landscape designing and the kind of trends that we see in interior magazines, etc., being very popular. So there's a lot of new introductions of different species of trees. Largely, the areas which we kind of take our walks, etc., are maintained very well in Lal Bagh. The areas which are very, very wild and people don't go there. And this is the unlandscaped part of Lal Bagh, which is mostly behind the rocky area of the hill which I showed you. But I think, yes, there are introductions of new species, exotic varieties of orchids, indoor plants, and it all depends on the kind of nurseries that are around which could bring them and multiply them. And Lal Bagh flower shows are known for bringing out these kind of exotic varieties of cacti, succulents, bonsai, and other species from other parts of southern India and also from the north. And it's a kind of a hub for plant lovers, and I think something somebody should explore if you're interested in plants and trees.
Right. So following up on that question is Arati Rao's question. Arati Rao says, do pollinators adapt or change when there is a mix of plants and trees that change with new gardens? What effect does manicuring have on native pollinators? Would you know about that, Suresh or Amita?
Amita, I think
Suresh,
you're the expert.
I'm not the expert at all, but Arti, I'll say that I don't know whether there have been those kinds of longitudinal studies or studies which take two separate areas and compare to see the extent to which there's a change in the numbers as well as in the species diversity of particular pollinators. But it would be a great thing to do. So I hope there are young people listening in and young biologists who would be able to carry this out. Because there has been, we know from experience, quite a significant decline in the number of insects across the world, but also in India. In the monsoons in Delhi, we would have a constant, almost, storm of beetles and all kinds of flying insects coming into our houses. Now no more. So there's probably a whole complex of ecological changes that we need to track. And we need to do that urgently in order that we can modify our urban environments to prevent this kind of loss. But thanks for that question.
Right. So Romita Ray says Diane Beresford in her Call of the Forest is advocating for protecting old growth indigenous trees that in turn protect native ecologies. Much of this vital layer of forest has been destroyed from the 18th century onwards, not just in India, but across the world. Do any such old growth trees still exist? Are they incorporated in the landscapes that you both have addressed?
I know of a lot of topus. The topus are kind of clusters of trees which are there in Bangalore. There can be a tamarind topu, a cluster of tamarind trees. There is an amazing old topu where in Nellore, which is called the Nellore topu, and also know many clusters of mango trees that have grown. Most of these are kind of considered sacred spaces and they're associated with the local folk traditions. There are a lot of worships of snakes and other folk gods in and around these areas. And the people trees, a very important element in Bangalore are the Arali Kattes, which are people tree platforms with the snake gods in front of them. Many religious functions happen around these people trees. There are also places where people of the area come and hang out, and it's a social space, a cultural space, and also a kind of uh, sacred space too. So these are kind of things that are which are very visible in Bangalore. But in terms of the topus, they are diminishing. Very few are intact, and there's not much effort to bring in a lot of native species. I think Bangalore's always had an eclectic taste in planting, so we see a lot of exotic species coming from different parts of the world. And because of the weather, temperate weather, I think anything survives in Bangalore.
Right. So, Praveen Rodriguez has an interesting question. He says, could we hear something about the fish varieties in the Lal Bagh Lake? Apparently, there are a lot of catfish there that keep it clean. If so, could the same be applied to Alsur Lake and the other Kere? Also, apparently, rights for fishing here are sold to hawkers in a clandestine manner. Could the government consider allowing or encouraging anglers to catch and release, thereby attracting more attention and support?
I do see a lot of fish in Lal Bagh, and some of them are carp, some of them are catfish. There is this tender that comes out where a fishing community comes and kind of fishes in Lal Bagh. I don't know whether Lal Bagh is open to have hobbyist fishing trends because of security and otherwise. But I think I see a lot of people in and around Alsur doing it.
Right. So, Amita, Pradeep Krishan wants to know whether you're in favor of replanting and rethinking the planting plans for the Central Vista.
Well, I wish I knew what the plans for the Central Vista actually were, because so far there's nothing in the public domain that would let us assess exactly what's going to happen, except what's been leaked out is horrible in terms of extending the footprint of the buildings, that are currently there. Now there's going to be far more, especially in the area where there's now open green space. I think any kind of planting plan should be thought about and reconsidered. Our needs change, our climate changes, um, our tastes change. And perhaps the Central Vista, after so many years, is indeed ready for that kind of conversation, but not something which is happening behind closed doors, where citizens who use that space as a public commons don't have a clue what's going on. And we have to then also think about the ways in which we are now planting in an extremely uncertain time. And the fact of climate change is around us. So the old kinds of ways of thinking perhaps may not work. The exigencies have also changed. The British wanted to leave this overwhelming impression of majesty and empire on the people who might travel up and down what was then Queensway and Kingsway. We don't necessarily need to do that now. We're a democracy. We need to be more inclusive. We have perhaps a different set of messages we want our landscapes, our cultivated landscapes to give. So I'll stop there, but I'm curious to know more about these plans for the Central Vista, even though I'm also a little scared.
Thank you for that timely question, Pradeep, and thank you for your insightful answer, Amita. So, Suresh, Meghna Manjunath says that I have heard that the British used Lal Bagh for their own purposes and even used it to experiment on fruit and vegetable species. Do we know how much of the planting in Lal Bagh today is what has survived from the original planting?
The British did use Lal Bagh as a base for experiments and economic botany enterprise. So a lot of trees and plants came from different parts of the world to this station, and here it was acclimatized and propagated. So this was the major enterprise. But at the same time, we also realized that they were very keen to grow a lot of trees like quinine, cinchona for quinine, and there is also teak wood, rosewood, mahogany, rubber plantations. Coffee and tea became very important. So in the planting of Lal Bagh, I think there are a lot of areas where the trees that the British and the Q-trained directors planted still exists, especially in the large vistas and the group plantings that we see. But the other shrubs are constantly changing in Lal Bagh, but mostly all the old trees are the ones that have been planted in the last 70 or 80 years.
Right.
Some of them are old, more than 100 years old. Yeah.
Okay. Amita, Poonam has a question for you, Poonam Sen. She says, were the British conscious about invasive species, or did they follow quarantine measures while bringing plants from their homeland when they introduced the Quarantine Act in 1914? Also, since pre-independence era gardens were mainly meant for pleasure, how can we focus on designing gardens that are sustainable and climate resilient?
Oh gosh, I don't think I can answer the second question, not in the time we have, and maybe not even if we take all day over it. I think the answer has to be very place specific. Every place is different, and its culture is different, what grows there is different. So there can be no uniform solution to what is actually a very, very place specific question. The first part of your question was about quarantines. And I'd have to say, oh gosh, no, they were not thinking about quarantines at all. In fact, that's the reason why what the whole system of colonialism did was to, in places, just wipe out entire human as well as animal populations because they carried germs with them. The effect of, say, smallpox on the Americas was devastating. It just, decimated the indigenous population. Other diseases as well. I mean, this has all been written about most accessibly in this book called Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, in case you want to have a quick look. But yes, diseases did travel around the world. Human ones, plant diseases, animal diseases, precisely because of the kind of global circulation of things and of living things that that empire brought about. It was only very much after the fact that attempts were made to try and control these movements. And in some ways, it still goes on. We're living in a pandemic today that's also caused by exactly those kinds of leaps and bounding species traveling around the world.
Right. So many of our viewers have questions about the sort of policies that go behind how certain plants are introduced in our public parks. And Divya Mudappa says, do you also see gardens as being a creative space for expression or art, and that they should therefore not be regulated?
I feel that gardens are creative commons and they should be open for society to come and mostly children and young people to come there, interact with each other, learn more about nature, and also go for these walks that they can have a kind of an experience which is really live, where they could smell flowers, slow down their lives, look at the bees and butterflies, and also learn about the different species that have become part of a landscape. Most often, people go for walks and jogs and they don't pause and look at the gardens. And I'm sure Cubbon Park has a bandstand, and Lal Bagh also has a bandstand. And these areas were used for cultural functions. And Lal Bagh Glasshouse, incidentally, has a long history where not only there were wedding receptions, but there were fantastic tea parties. There were bands, military bands playing, but also there were music programs and dance programs in the Cubbon Park bandstand and the Lal Bagh Glass House. So they've always been a place where people come. And I think this should continue because these are the only public spaces that are alive, and they are very democratic. And I feel that that's the way these gardens should be used for. And also for resistance, also for public meetings, also for strikes. Cubbon Park has been a place where a lot of strikes and demonstrations have taken place earlier, but now they've moved it to Freedom Park. But this park was known for a lot of demonstrations and strikes against the government. And it is a very social space for everybody. And I think this is very, very important in our days today.
Amita, how would you like to respond to that?
I think Suresh said it beautifully. And I think that the idea of a creative commons where we get to express ourselves, learn something about the world around us, and come to appreciate our relationship with it is what gardens and cities are all about. So may we have more of them. And I think Suresh said all there was to say on this.
There are many more interesting questions that are coming in, but unfortunately, we seem to have run out of time. Thank you so much, Amita and Suresh, for coming in, for talking to our audience about the social sort of significance of public parks and gardens in urban spaces, and also giving us insight about the philosophy and the sort of planning that goes behind these spaces, which we often take for granted. Thank you so much for coming in, and thank you to our audience for asking such brilliant, wonderful questions. I would like to remind you to fill out the feedback form, which has been put in the chat box. And Suresh and Amita, if there's anything that you'd like to say before we close the session.
Very happy to be with Amita because it's amazing that I've made a new friend in this class because we've never met before. And I'm sure we're going very soon.
I hope so. It was really lovely talking to you, Suresh. So thank you, Gayatri, for moderating this. Thank you, Phytopia, for inviting me to join this. And thank you, all the listeners who've been participating in the conversation as well. Thanks, and bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.